Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and hello everybody. My name is Amir and today I would like to talk about SMO modifications that have recently that were recently proposed. Earlier in August 2026, Alexander Mercurius of the Duran explained and ex- talked of an intriguing incident. President Vladimir Putin stated to the Duma's deputies that a veteran of the SMO, whom he recently decorated, desired that the SMO be accelerated. President Vladimir replied that he agreed. The Duma applauded. He then stated that this is not being done now because the pace of advances is being balanced by the rate of Russian casualties. This is why the Russian government did not accelerate the SMO's pace. The incident itself is still an acknowledgement of public pressure. Combine this with his spokesman Dmitry Peskov's words that this is no longer an SMO. It is now a war due to the West's provocations. And this may, as Alexander asserts, be indicative of Russia accelerating its pace. Additionally, the confident, even cheerful way he recalled this incident adds weight to the likelihood of such a readjustment. He is encouraging them in a way that has never been seen before. There is also reason to believe that there is another reason to believe that the SMO must be upgraded. The front lines typically change drastically in the midsummer. This is the time when Ukraine's military routes are most salient. We have seen this ever since the SMO began. Ukraine is now facing severe fuel shortages. Russia is now blockading all of Ukraine's remaining ports in the Black Sea. And earlier this year, Russia was battlefield testing the Oreshnik missiles, improving its 36 submunitions accuracy in urban areas as production ramps up. Russia has now encircled Druzhovka, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which form Ukraine's last enclave within the Donetsk Oblast. All of these all of these point to the inevitability of Russia continuing on its advance into other areas, such as Sumy, Kharkov oblasts, and possibly Odessa, which would cause it to go into Nikolaev Oblast. It could also lead to the capture of Nikolaev city itself, which lies not too far from the coastline. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson also explains that Ukraine's neighbors, particularly Poland, have become fed up with Ukraine. The SMO continues to take a giant toll on Ukraine and NATO's existential stability. Both Ukraine and NATO have been unable to as much as resist Russia's advances across Ukraine, and the recent drone campaign has only resulted in minimal damage across Russia. A massive missile campaign in retaliation, combined with a Black Sea blockade, which has completely ceased any Ukrainian economic transit to the EU regarding important grain that is just coming into harvest. This, of course, represents a loss in Ukrainian revenue, but more importantly, it means that the EU will be losing a key key imports, given how it previously had imported fertilizer from Russia to sustain its own agriculture. And finally, Pepe Escobar explains that Ukraine attacking Iran in the Caspian Sea under US orders is essentially NATO attacking a lake that serves as a highway between Iran and Russia as part of the international north-south transportation corridor. Now, Ukraine is admitting that this attack was a mistake, but each aggressive but each aggressive action only stokes global tensions. And this is not the only time Ukraine has gotten itself involved in Southwest Asia. We have confirmed reports of Ukrainian special forces operating in Iraq. They have been training jihadists in Mali, and they supported jihadists during their breakout from Idlibistan, as Pepe Escobar calls it, through Aleppo and finally onto Damascus and across Syria. All of this indeed proves that Ukraine, despite its deteriorating domestic circumstances, has chosen to act against its own interests by deploying its forces abroad, which of course is itself counterproductive given that it is fighting its main export and import market, that being Russia, in the first place. And on to the diplomatic front concerning the West, Larry Johnson explains that the US's efforts at diplomacy emerged after it could not topple Iran's government. Iran accepted if Iran had accepted the MOU if Israel had ceased its invasion of Lebanon. This never happened. What is happening is that the US is running out of oil and oil products. Its missiles cannot be replenished in time to continue the second imposed war. We have seen this continue on. We have seen this continue on with no end in sight, which compels the US to inevitably agree to whatever deal Iran dictates, if it ever does, which the Iranian people seem to reject. Same with Russia. It had accommodated the US many times, but the US was never interested. For example, he cites how Russia was willing to withdraw from Donbas in April 2024 if there were guarantees that the Russian speakers in the area could speak Russian without discrimination, and that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church remained insulated from politics. Now, along with the Donbas, Dnipropetrovsk and Kherson Oblasts have acceded to the Russian Federation. There is also signs, as I have hinted, that Nikolaev, Odessa, Sumy and Kharkov Oblasts may soon follow. Russia exclaimed that it would continue as and as for US internal politics, there was a particularly stinging assessment made by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He explained that the US is in a unique phase in its history. This is due to its politicians, military leaders, advisors, procedures, and the domestic and international circumstances. All of these entrap President Donald John in a net with no hope of rescue. Excuse me. He cannot leave the Strait of Hormuz because the US needs oil, among other reasons, of course. He has no ammo to continue to fight Iran. He is trapped on Iran's nuclearization because he rejected the JCPOA back in his first term and has not replaced it with anything. He remains mesmerized with the possibility of reviving US imperialism in Southwest Asia despite his defeats. And he aims to do it by and he aims to do it through Saudi Arabia by allowing it the chance to have a nuclear program as long as it signs on to the Abraham Accords. Indeed, the very same accords that I have stated were long dead, and many analysts have agreed that so far there has been no movement in either the accords number of signatories or any further recognition across across or any other productive works that the accords could be credited to. Ansarallah stopped Ansarallah effectively blocked Saudi Arabia in this maneuvering when it initiated its own blockade. Uniquely, President Donald is also trapped by Zionism. He is facing Zionist pressure from within via his donors like Miriam Adelson and abroad via Israel. If Israel expands its aggression to force a reaction from Turkey, Russia, or China even, it could risk Israel's very existence. And on the topic of Israel, Colonel Lawrence believes that Israel's fate as a state is already sealed by an antagonized Iran, the main power in Southwest Asia. And finally, President Donald's current political approach, which was hidden during his re-election, which is very important, as previously in the 2016 election, it was far more widely advertised. This time, his approach is to win everything. This style of leadership is one he cannot change. Of course, there is no way he can win everything. All of the mistakes rather he has made are of a personal rather than a political nature, and worse, these mistakes could entomb Southwest Asia and ultimately the world in a global world. Already, 20% of the global south does not have sufficient access to food. These people could become economic refugees bound for Europe and North America. Eventually, these refugees will be forcibly turned away at their borders. The picture Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson paints is indeed grim. It is, of course, based on reality. There is no appetite for more immigration, let alone refugees, by the publics of the EU, the UK, or North America even. There is, however, increasing economic instability as the world moves forward into the oil depression. Simultaneously, Russia, China, and Iran continue to maintain their axis without any signs of faltering, either due to sanctions, military pressure, or however many coalitions the West likes to create. No amount of proxies have been able to have been able to rescue the West from its decaying economic plan. Nor has there been any change in the military front that the West has been so reliant upon for its own soft power, quote unquote, which is essentially just its propaganda and its reputation based on popular culture rather than facts and actual study, and diplomatic pressures, which could mean more coercive measures such as sanctions, tariffs, access to patents, or even their own markets. And this ties in neatly to to Western financial cannibalism. Professor Richard Professor Richard explains that NATO's chief European backers, although they will not admit it publicly, concede that they are no longer competitive industrial capitalist societies. After World War II, they sought to rebuild their societies with the help of the US until 1975. When US support dried up, the Europeans began to provide credit to their peoples via credit cards as soon as they emerged, and they hired cheap labor from abroad. In the last 10 to 15 years, these measures had reached their limit. The working classes will no longer permit their governments to hire more immigrant labor. China's competitiveness means that the Europeans have an increasingly shrinking export market. President Donald has stripped Europe of its subsidized protection in NATO, and American oligarchs are okay with this turn of events. They are okay with this because Europe itself is a captive market of the US now that it no longer produces and only consumes. This is made even more salient when the US started exporting fuels, mainly gas, to the EU just after it had bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, resulting in Russia completely completely cutting off fuel supplies as a form of government policy. As a form of government policy. The gas, which previously would have been earmarked for Europe in the decades past, now go to China. Simultaneously, France itself is facing shortages in its own nuclear industry. As some of you might know, Niger, after its recent coup, started to hike up the price of its uranium ore from 3 euro cents to 50 euro cents per kilogram, I believe. This had caused France to look elsewhere for key uranium ore as opposed to simply buying slightly higher uranium. This, combined with increasingly aging NPPs in France, which have yet to be overhauled, or the lack of any new designs that came online in the last 10-20 years, have forced France into more conventional fuels such as natural gas and oil. This, of course, means that Europe is essentially fuel starved, minus the US, whose natural gas is several times more expensive than Russian gas, which used to come in, and Europe owes to its competitive advantage to that low priced gas, means that Europe has no option but to follow US dictates. And from the sounds many governments have been making, that is a trade they are all the more that is a trade they are happy to make, even at the cost of their own voter base. This, of course, will have very serious political implications. And with the backdrop of the oil depression, will only accelerate the number of governments coming in and out of power and doing little incremental steps, or even making no steps to appease their voters. All of this All of this paints indeed a grim picture for Europe's own fate. But it must be remembered that this is all self inflicted. The EU was under no obligation to allow the US to bomb Nord Stream. It did so regardless. Nor was it under any obligation to create such massive structures of government control, such as the European Central Bank, the EU itself, even, or the EU itself, even. What started off as a simple common market has ballooned into all an a supranational state with no bearing in history or culture. Such organizations are meant to Such organizations will always be tested until they finally break. I also want to add that the Makkah Joint Defense Agreement itself is not exactly a defense agreement in in the truest sense of the word. The agreement itself has little basis in terms of collective security, given that all three countries do not have any collective security agreements, do not have any strategies for collective security. Their militaries have never operated together, nor is there any plans to operate together. Additionally, the agreement itself is of the agreement itself remains opaque. So questions on whether there are any economic obligations or diplomatic obligations tied to the agreement remain unanswered and open to speculation. What is certain, though, and or at least highly probable, is that that the big two of these three, Turkey and Pakistan, are not going to entertain any foreign adventures of Saudi Arabia into either Yemen or Iran. There is no way they would allow this to happen. Pakistan would risk its neutrality and goodwill, as highlighted by Iran repeatedly in the recent MOU that has been torn apart by the US, and Turkey would risk outstretching itself as it continues to man an increasingly fractured Syria, all the while being hounded by Israel, or at least being threatened to be hounded by Israel. There is also other intriguing news. Professor Muhammad Marandi explained that there is evidence that the GCC member states are starting to withdraw their money from the US to repair their damaged economies by maintaining their imports. The US, of course, will make sure to keep most of this money in its stock and bond markets. This also means the increasingly unstable AI bubble, which has threatened to pop. And if it does so, it would take out perhaps most, if not all, of the Magic 7, thereby leading to yet another economic financial crisis. Similar, only far, far larger in amplitude than the North Atlantic financial crisis we have seen in 2007. But there are, but the US still maintains, frustratingly, some influence in Southwest Asia economically. He explains that he explains that the US had given $500 million of Iraq's own oil money to keep Iraq from retaliating against Saudi Arabia in the previous against Saudi Arabia in the previous in the previous video. I had talked about how a Saudi US airstrike had targeted Iraq's popular mobilization units and that Iraq had vowed retaliation. Well, no retaliation came, and this is why. He continues that this strange transaction is the result of Iraq still being under UN sanctions and Iraq's overall role in the Gulf War of 1990-1991. The oil for infrastructure trade with China has angered the US and, he asserts, will make its enabler, Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, who was the Prime Minister before the current Prime Minister Ali Faleh took power, an historic figure who sought to liberate Iraq. This as this was an important first move towards independence that had triggered his forced departure under US pressure. I remember that quite well. Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi was actually the go-between when it came to Iran and Russia, when it came to Iran and Saudi Arabia's negotiations, which previously was being handled with Russia. Russia later on passed this diplomatic overture to China, and China managed to strike the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it really did work, at least for a few years. China had managed to do something that the US could never have done, even during the Cold War. It had managed to reconcile two serious enemies who also happened to be two of the largest political powers in Southwest Asia, with Iran being both a military and an oil power, along with oil and industrial power, and Saudi Arabia being a religious power, along with a key oil exporter to the West. This was quite a transitional moment, as it signified to the global south that problems could be solved between one another as long as the US and its satellites stayed out of the way. But it culminated in US backed riots across Iraq, forcing Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi to vacate office before his term before his term and would eventually pave the way for far weaker prime ministers. Thank you very much for watching. I I hope you had learned much, and I look forward to your comments and any discussions or questions you might have. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Goodbye.